I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Biomass Sustainability in Northern New England. Our speakers today are Andy Fast of the UNH Cooperative Extension and Adam Sherman of VEIC, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. The webinars are sponsored by Froling Energy, and we do have a number of biomass webinars scheduled for June and July of 2020. We have on the 7th of July, dry wood chip boiler systems and PDCs. Good review of all the different fuels that are available, the green chips, wood pellets, and dry chips, comparing them and then emphasizing the dry wood chip boiler systems that we are so active in installing. We're also going to tell you more about 6 particular projects on July 14th that are also burning the dry wood chips to show you some variety and a little bit more detail. You may not need to see both of these presentations, but sometimes to see the real situations instead of the theoretical makes a big difference. And that's what we'll be doing on the 14th. And on the 21st, we have tentatively air emission compliance with biomass boilers. And we're also planning something for July 28th. So keep in touch here. Other webinars will be scheduled. You can also find us on our website, frolingenergy.com. And you can always call. You can see a number here that you can call to get more information. The webinars are usually recorded and they appear on our website in the Resources tab. Froling Energy is a biomass boiler system installer. We are working mainly in school buildings and campuses, although we do a lot of work in industrial buildings, commercial buildings, and multifamily buildings, and some residential. One of the biggest things that we do is assist in engineers and architects and owners with project feasibility, and then getting right into design. And when they get serious mechanical specifications, initial estimating, value engineering, trying to get these projects off the ground. And we can also assist in ROI calculations. And obviously, as we get into projects, we get involved in project management and a lot of turnkey projects start to finish. Again, today's webinar is on biomass sustainability in Northern New England with our speakers, Andy Fast of the UNH Cooperative Extension and Adam Sherman of VEIC. Let me tell you a little bit about Andy before we get started. He's a forest specialist with the UNH Cooperative Extension. He provides support to New Hampshire's forest industry through educational programming, economic development, research, and meeting with forest-based businesses throughout New Hampshire. He's got a Master of Science in Forestry from UNH, and he has been with the UNH Cooperative Extension since 2018. He's also worked for the U.S. Forest Service and the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. And Adam Sherman, who will speak second, is a senior consultant with VEIC. That's the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Adam is nationally recognized expert in renewable heating and cooling. He consults with clients to identify and enact measures that achieve building decarbonization goals. He has 20 years collaborating on renewable heating programs and projects on local, regional, and national scales. His experience, expertise, and abilities have maneuvered many stakeholders through a variety of challenges encountered in the deployment of energy technologies, renewable energy technologies. He's a pretty busy guy. So we'll start out. I'd like to introduce Andy Fast of UNH Cooperative Extension.
This is intended to be an introduction to this topic and just an overview, but hopefully it's beneficial to everyone. Everyone feels it's worthwhile, and I think it's a good starting place to engage in a dialogue. What I'm hoping to cover today is talking a little bit about sustainable forestry, just so everyone kind of has that sort of background and perspective. Talk a little bit about our northern forests, and that's New York, Vermont, Hampshire, and Maine, or that's sort of how we're defining it here, the entirety of those states. Cover a little bit of basic silviculture, and that's the art and science of growing trees. And then just, briefly touch on tree utilization. But before I get into the meat of it, feel like it's important to sort of define biomass and sustainability. So, typically when we hear the term biomass, often it's referred to as the total volume of organic matter in an area. So that could be, you have 150 tons of biomass, above ground biomass per acre. So it's really common that biomass is used that way. But for the purposes of this presentation, what we're talking about, we're really talking about biomass as a product. And that's chipped wood that can come from sawmills or from forests and from loggers. And there's a few different kind of classifications of chips or products that are produced, and they all go to different markets. So kind of one of the main points I want to get across is that there's complexity in everything that I'm talking about, and there's nuance in everything I'm talking about. And the more we talk about it, the more it sort of opens up. So I just, an example would be these chips. I'm sure a lot of us think of, wood chips as all being the same. You have mill chips that come from sawmills. So when logs are broken down into lumber, there's residual sort of pieces of wood and cuttings that are chipped up, and you have a very clean, solid wood chip that results from that. There's also another kind of bowl chip, where in the woods, loggers cut trees and they may cut out a certain log from that tree, so a 16-foot section, let's say, and that could be debarked and chipped up. And that's another type of chip that's a little bit different than the one coming from the mill. And these can also be, processed additional to those, general sort of ways of doing it. All these can be screened, what have you. But that's also a pretty clean chip. Then there's whole tree chipping, where, maybe a smaller tree or, really poorly formed tree, the whole thing just goes into the chipper. And that's not as clean. It's not just solid wood. You have bark and branches and leaves and all this extra stuff. I just want to point out, you have these different sorts of chips associated with the product that have different markets. And then also really important is that biomass harvesting requires special equipment. So there's a conventional logger that just sort of has a chainsaw and is out in the woods, they can only, it's very difficult for them to cut a lot of small trees across a very large acreage. So, biomass chipping equipment, whole tree chipping equipment, that's really set up for those clear cuts, and they have chippers, whereas other loggers don't have. That sounds basic, but it is important to think about, because it's important when we talk about the management and biomass harvesting as a tool. So let's talk about sustainability briefly. So this is something that people have talked about, great minds have thought about for a long time, and we could probably spend, a whole semester talking about sustainability. So it's complex. There's different concepts of sustainability, but I think one of the trends when we're thinking about sustainability as it relates to forestry is, the trend seems to be, over a given area, over a given period of time, you don't want to deplete the resource. And that could be viewed as, you don't want less volume per acre over a given time period. You want sort of the same amount of volume or more over a given time period over a given area. Now you can expect, as you have harvests, that removes some trees. So that's why it's important to think of time period and area and scale, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then also, in addition to that kind of traditional concept, I think increasingly folks have recognized the importance of ecosystem services, and we're not just worried about a sustained yield of fiber from our woods, but our woods provide a lot of societal benefit, ecological benefit, spiritual benefit, in addition to the economic benefits it provides. So I think we've moved to this place where, sustainability is broadened to safeguarding our natural resources and ecosystem services. And just wanted to point out, I found it interesting, this is also sustainability relates to our consumptive needs. And it's interesting with the run on toilet paper, how many, folks are suddenly, interested and care about the supply chain, some of these lower grade products, which is good, that awareness. All right, so sustainable forestry. So as we move on, I think one other point is context. Everything we talk about, context is important. And again, I want to emphasize, things are nuanced. But thinking about spatial and temporal scale in the context of sustainable forestry and biomass sustainability. So when I look at this clear cut, this is a 10-acre clear cut in New Hampshire. You can see all the brown in the middle of it. And, that's just more or less, bare ground. And I think a lot of people look at that and say, understandably, this is not all right. This is not sustainable. This is not acceptable practices. And this can only be done efficiently through, whole tree harvesting equipment. But as you sort of, hold on. But as you sort of step back and start looking at scale and spatial scale, that green shape in the middle, if everyone can see that, that is that same 10-acre clear cut within the framework of sort of this broader matrix of different size openings, different treatments across the landscape. So that's a 10-acre opening. There's other smaller, 1 or 2 acre openings. All that bare area around that 10-acre opening was managed forest, where there's been recent, timber harvests and thinnings, as well as some untreated areas that have been treated in the past, but are basically closed canopy. So that practice that looks unsustainable close up right when it happens, 5 years later, is greened up. And within the context of that broader landscape, actually provides a lot of benefit. And so the benefits it provides, some examples would be New Hampshire Fish and Game, and I'm using this New Hampshire example. Our state Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife Department encourages clear cuts, large clear cuts. 5 acres is good, 10 acres is better, and they want 10% of our landscape in that early successional habitat, they call it, because it supports declining species. So, we want diversity, and this supports a number of species. So it's good to have some of these clear cuts. From a wildlife standpoint, it's good to have some closed canopy. You don't want this everywhere. So that diversity is good, and this is very appropriate for this site. Also, as I mentioned, there can be societal benefits. So this is an area people can recreate. If you look down on this particular site, there's a lot of blueberry, so that's your blueberry pies if you get out there, walk around. And then also these big openings create more, or on this site in particular, I should say, it was heavy to hemlock. So mostly hemlock was populating the area. And by doing this 10-acre clear cut, already you see a much more diverse species mix of trees coming up. And so I want to be clear, this is, again, nuance, context is everything. So should you have 10-acre clear cuts on steep slopes and highly erodible soils next to, water bodies? I don't think that's sustainable. But I think this is a tool within the context of our other tools across the landscape that can benefit both wildlife and people. So moving along with that sort of principle of diversity, and diversity being tied in with ecology and sustainability, we sort of have this we have a real diverse land ownership kind of pattern where most of the land in the Northeast, in the states we're talking about, is privately held. As it's held by private landowners, and those private landowners all have different priorities for their land. You know, I bet if we went around the room, our virtual room today, you know, and asked everyone, hey, what would you do with your 100 acres? I bet some people would say, hey, I wouldn't touch it. I don't even want to go out there. I hate the woods. Some other people would say, oh, I want to recreate. Other people would want to go hunting. Some people would want to manage it for forests, some for wildlife, some birding. And so that kind of natural diversity of opinions and among private landowners creates what we saw here in this picture with sort of diverse treatments across the landscape, right? And so, you know, I think that lends to this idea of sustainability, you know, that helps safeguard that sustainability. But we can't just rely on, you know, a lot of different types of landowners with different priorities. So there's education in these different states, and for natural resource professionals, which includes certification programs for loggers on kind of natural resource management and protecting water and different laws, as well as kind of logging specific information. Foresters have certifications nationally, or a certification nationally, and state licensures. Just want to mention, for those who aren't familiar with the difference between a logger and a forester, a logger's out there cutting the trees. You know, they're good equipment operators, they're great at merchandising the wood. And then you have foresters that go to school to learn how to manage the forests and for specific purposes. And often a forester will help landowners meet their goals. And a loggers, and they could act as a seller's agent in a real estate transaction, which is selling timber. And the loggers are often buying the wood. So that's just wanted to point out those differences in case anyone wasn't aware of that. You know, so we have education, then there's also voluntary best management practices to help kind of safeguard, or particularly water, you know, and soils. And then we have different laws that, you know, help protect kind of the public interest and so on. But also want to point out, a lot of these laws occur at the state level rather than at the local level. And that's, that can be very helpful to folks who are trying to do business. It's really important and helpful to them. You know, just like a lot of our national commerce laws, it can be a huge barrier to business if, you know, there's a lot of local differences and regulations. It's very hard just to move products. You know, there may be different weight limits on different roads, and you're trying to get from point A to B. So the more it's sort of pushed up to the state level or national level, that sort of provides a little bit fewer barriers to sort of, you know, doing business between towns. All right. You know, also in terms of sustainability, you know, I mentioned earlier, you know, one of the metrics we use is this idea of, are we growing kind of more volume across our acreage than we're removing? So here's just some numbers between Maine, New Hampshire, you know, New York, Vermont, of you have net growth. And so net growth means you have a bunch of trees growing, but you also have some that die every year. So once you pull out all the trees that die and reduce that volume, and then you do all these harvesting, all these states still have a big surplus, right? New Hampshire's, after all the trees die and all the harvesting, we're still growing twice as much as we're harvesting. In Maine, it's 1.5 times more. In New York, there's over 3 times as much, you know, growth as there is trees being harvested, even after mortality. So this isn't, you know, the end all and be all of, you know, that we're doing sustainable management across the region, by no means, but it's certainly a good indicator that, you know, we're not depleting our forest resources. The trees are growing out there. You know, so biomass isn't depleting everything. So a quick forestry overview, because I think this is important, just thinking about where these products come from and, as it relates to biomass. So in forest management, there's a couple different things that foresters, if they're looking at a given site, they may be looking at in two different ways. So one is from a regeneration standpoint, we don't do much planting around here. So are we trying to get specific species to grow in a given area, or are we looking at it from a tending standpoint, and that's sort of more like your garden, where there's only so much growing space that can be occupied, per acre. And we want to weed that acre. We want to weed that garden of, smaller stuff, defective trees, so we can concentrate growth on the big, healthy trees. So again, there's regenerating, and then there's that tending or thinning. And so as we're thinking about that, we have this idea, again, this is a simple model, but there's this idea of shade tolerance. So certain species germinate and are successful under different light conditions. So hemlock will germinate in full shade, and will just sort of hang out there for decades. They're amazing. They'll spend 100 years just sitting underneath a bigger tree waiting for it to die, and then they'll do great. White pine or red oak, they need sort of medium amounts of light, or do best and germinate best in medium amounts of light. And
I might have lost him. I think we lost our speaker here for momentarily. So Andy, are you still there?
I think I'm still here.
Okay, that's good. We lost you.
Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go right ahead. Continue on.
Oh, okay. Whew. All right. And everyone can see my screen fine?
Andy, it's not being shared right now, I think. So.
Okay. So just give me one moment, and I apologize for whatever just happened.
We'll survive.
Yep. So back to this. I don't know when you may have lost me, but I was just saying, different trees sort of germinate under different light conditions. Jim, you can hear me fine now?
Yes, we can.
Yep, great. And then, as it relates to biomass harvesting, white birch, aspen, they need really large, if you want a white birch stand, you need a fair amount of light. There could be a white birch that shows up kind of, in medium amounts of light, but, if you're going to get a lot of white birch, a lot of aspen, they come into clear cuts, and there's really no way around it. As soon as they start getting any real competition, they start dying off a little bit more. So it's, just this concept that different trees need different amounts of light to germinate and, have different strategies. And so as that relates to forestry, when we're thinking of treating the woods, you have that clear cut in the top left. That can be a very deliberate and effective practice for trying to get specific species to get established and grow. There's nothing wrong with a silvicultural clear cut to try and get specific species. And that's something we use as a tool. As you look at the top right, that's a shelter wood. You see maybe 2/3 of the trees, 60% of the trees are removed, and that's going to get more of our oak and pine. Again, this is generalizations, but that's how you try to regenerate naturally those species. Down at the bottom left, that's single tree selection, where you'll get more hemlock, beech, sugar maple on real nice sites. That functions almost as a closed canopy light regime. The same species are in the single tree selection as closed canopy. And the bottom right are group selections. So you cut a handful of trees in a given area, again, to create intermediate light regimes and certain species that respond to them. And those groups can actually start getting bigger and bigger into patches. If you want to get more of those sort of shade intolerant species, like I said, the birches. And then there's this continuum up to that pure clear cut, which you have different definitions, but it really is just a continuum between a group and a larger clear cut for specific purposes. Now, the other piece of this kind of simple model for what, where trees grow and how to get specific trees to grow in a given area is the soil. So certain species like different soils. Pine and oak and beech, they're on drier sites. You may have more hemlock, sugar maple, white ash, and more richer sites. So if you think of, deliberately trying to grow certain species for biomass, or not for, for people or for wildlife or any of these goals, you can kind of use this simple model to try to predict and get certain species to grow. So that's that regeneration piece for foresters. Then also I mentioned there's a tending or thinning part. Again, it's sort of like, your garden here. On the left, you can see there's some crop trees. Those are the best trees that this forester saw as they were walking through this stand. They want to create, they cut some adjacent trees around those trees in the canopy. So the goal is to give those best trees more growing space in their canopy where they can get more leaf area. And the more leaf area they get, the more photosynthesis there is, the more energy there is, and the more they can allocate that energy to diameter growth, to height growth, to different chemicals and compounds that protect them from insects and diseases and so on. But again, this is really just like, this is analogous, I guess, to, the garden I have outside where, I'm looking at my beets and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to find my best beets and then sort of thin the smaller ones around. And you can see over on the right, tree age can correlate with size, but a lot has to do with the amount of growing space they had. So that western hemlock at the bottom there is 50 years old. That was a suppressed tree. There were other trees up on top of it. I can almost guarantee it just based on its size. The red alder had plenty of space like those crop trees on the left. The northern red oak had plenty of space like the trees on the left. So that's the thinning piece. Here's another example where you can see for the first, this is about a 200-year-old tree. You can see from the middle, there's a pencil there on the right. To give you a sense of scale. And so I don't know, that pencil's maybe 6 inches. So for the first 130 years, the tree grew maybe 6 inches, a little more than that. Then it was released in the 1938 hurricane, which is similar to sort of, you cut a tree and it's gone, or a hurricane knocks it over, it's functionally the same. So after this tree was released, had more growing space, you can see how quickly it grew. And so, so those are some kind of forestry basics, and wanted to touch on tree utilization. Sometimes there's a perception that, biomass, people take really nice trees and, biomass those and chip them up. And if you look at sort of this infographic here at the bottom left in the orange, those are kind of the highest value products we have. They come from usually the bottom of a tree. They're branch-free logs. It can be turned into saw logs or veneer, so high quality. It can be sold to a landowner could sell this tree to a logger for anywhere from $40 a ton to $200 a ton or more for, veneer quality wood. There's very little economic incentive. So I'm not saying a tree like that could never go in the chipper. There's just really no reason to do that. And it just, really shouldn't happen often, and just doesn't because of the economics. And that's turned into one product. So as you look a little bit higher into that band of round wood, higher up on the tree, that's sort of black, you see much more branches coming out. And, that branchy sort of higher portion of the tree, if it's still of adequate diameter, it can be turned into firewood depending on the species. It can be turned into pallet logs. It's a lower grade lumber, so it can be sawn up into lumber, but really low grade lumber. And this is maybe where, you could also cut that log out, debark it, and use those bowl chips and send them to a paper mill, or maybe, Froling, I think, uses this kind of material for their chips. Generally, there's pellet mills that could use that kind of material. So, a bigger tree higher up, or a smaller tree, as you look right, that kind of the one in the middle there, that's probably of adequate diameter, probably too small to be turned into a saw log and that higher value product, but maybe you're thinning around a better tree and would cut that tree to turn it into, that bowl wood or bowl chips. And then you have the blue section, and that's those biomass chips that I mentioned way back towards the beginning of this presentation. And you could have really junky trees, that you cut and just biomass the whole thing, tops, limbs. That ends up being those kind of dirtier chips that, maybe go more to electricity. But I think the take-home message here is that, you have different parts of the tree that go to different markets, and a successful sort of biomass market really has to do more with residuals and byproducts than it does about, taking really good trees and biomassing them and using, those biomass markets as a primary market. If that makes sense. Lastly, just want to point out that, the forest industry is a really important part of, especially the rural economy in the Northeast. And so here's just a few numbers I wanted to point out. 5.2 billion of output from Maine, 1.5 billion from New Hampshire and Vermont, and 13.5 billion. There's significant employment numbers associated with this. And again, I want to emphasize, often these are more rural jobs and opportunities in areas where there may not be a whole lot of other opportunities around. So it's really beneficial in a lot of ways to our communities and our respective states. So in conclusion, just wanted to mention again, there's complexity with everything that I've been talking about. I've provided, some simple models and kind of an overview. I think it's a good starting point, and hopefully a good point to, start a discussion with other people and continue from there. I want to, hopefully got the point across that biomass harvesting's a tool to improve the forest. So as you're doing those improvement cuts, you tend to be cutting lower quality trees to help better trees grow faster. And those big clear cuts, oftentimes there's, state wildlife goals and objectives associated with those kind of activities. And I absolutely, again, want to say, every clear cut's not good. Definitely not every biomass harvest is not good. But it certainly has a role among our forests and forest management. And yeah, these low grade markets are really important markets, particularly right now, which is a whole nother conversation. And states are growing more than they're removing.
Okay, Andy, thank you. And we'll take questions after Adam's presentation, but you can definitely submit your questions in the chat panel, which is that little cartoon balloon in one of the circles on the bottom of your screen, probably the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to turn this over to Adam Sherman now from the EIC to talk about the sustainability side of things.
Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, thanks Jim. Thanks Andy. That was a perfect segue to lay a foundation to look at the carbon issue. And so Jim had asked me to talk a little bit about how local wood heating can be an effective tool for lowering long-term CO2 emissions compared to fossil heating. As many of you probably have heard, and this is a hot topic. There's a lot of debate, and yeah, I've got 20 minutes, so I'm just really going to be skimming the surface on this topic. But there's a lot more to it. But I think this will serve as a good primer and can tee up some good Q&A following the slide presentation. I should just step back and just introduce BERC. The program that I run is the Biomass Energy Resource Center. It is actually a program of BEIC, which stands for the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. It's actually a mission-driven nonprofit organization. It's been around for about 30 years, covering a wide range of sustainable energy work across the region and really across North America, from electrical energy efficiency to renewable heating and cooling to transportation, both efficiency and renewables. So we cover a lot of ground. That's a little bit of an infomercial about the organization, but we'll dive into the content now. So first thing I want to do is really just kind of hit the $60,000 question here. Is that there's kind of conflicting messaging that's been out there for the last decade or so. And I suspect a lot of people on the webinar today have seen kind of these conflicting messages of kind of the historical claims of biomass energy or wood energy being 100% categorically carbon neutral, where there's absolutely no net effect, and that wood energy is spewing carbon and that it's actually worse than burning coal. So I really want to spend some time on our time together here to kind of probe these issues and reconcile some of the differences of what's out there, break down some of the misnomers and go into some of the nuance and clear up some of these commonly held misconceptions that people have, and also make a clear distinction between their different forms of biomass energy. There's good forms and there's some not so good forms. We'll talk more about that. So, I think in terms of like the science and some of this conflicting message, I think it's important to note that the science is not really conflicting. The real issue of why there's differing outcomes of a number of studies in the last decade is really essentially carbon accounting is, well, just that. It's carbon accounting, and how you choose to define the boundaries of the framework is the major predeterminant of the outcome and the main reason why we hear these kind of differing conclusions on what the overall impacts are of wood energy. I'll dive in a little bit more into that detail. So this is getting kind of wonky pretty fast on the third slide here, but we can define different boundaries in setting up a carbon accounting framework to look at the numbers. And this slide just illustrates that you can focus in on just the amount of carbon that's fluxing in the forest and how that changes under different silvicultural treatments. You can then kind of measure the carbon coming out of the forest as part of a harvest and trace the life cycle of those harvested wood products. And then you can also take an even broader field of vision and scope in these analysis and quantify the product substitutions and comparative analysis against the business as usual scenario, whether it be using timber products in buildings to displace energy intensive materials like concrete and steel and plastic and glass, or using wood fuel as an alternative to burning fossil fuels for energy. But then also even broadening the scope of vision in some of these studies is accounting for the difference in the amount of carbon stored in the forest between a harvest and no harvest scenario. So the reason that we have kind of one study looking at apples and another study looking at oranges and getting fruit salad is that, you know, different studies define the boundaries of their analysis differently. And in addition to that, there are also these issues of temporal or the time and spatial scale of the analysis. So whether the analysis is over like a very short time period of 5 or 10 years, or, you know, a much longer time period of 50 to 100 years. And you know, it's important to point out that IPCC, you know, life cycle carbon framework is oftentimes looking at 100-year life cycles for carbon emissions of various products, goods, and energy pathways. This study, I threw this in here because it does a great job looking at the literature. It's a literature review, peer-reviewed Journal of Forestry, came out a couple of years ago. The link is down below, but to do a deeper dive on just kind of how this finding the boundaries of a life cycle analysis can differ, this paper does a great job of providing more detail that I really just can't get into in this presentation. So the next point that's really also important to spend a little time on is that not all pathways are created equal. And so, you know, biomass, as Andy said, can mean different things to different people. It can be algae growing and producing, you know, biodiesel. It can be wood chips going into a large power plant. A lot of the recent controversy and a lot of the backlash against biomass energy in the last couple of years has really focused in this top pathway. And for good reason. I actually completely agree with many of the anti-biomass organizations that taking wood fiber harvested from fairly questionable forest practices in southeastern United States, producing pellets, you know, on a very, very large scale, and shipping those finished pellets halfway around the world to co-fire in a coal-fired power plant in the UK, and at a very low efficiency of 30 to 35% efficiency for steam turbine technology. And by dribbling in some pellets, you know, you're enabling a that coal plant to continue operating and meeting its carbon targets. So it's not even being used as a direct substitute to eliminate that coal usage, but actually keep that plant alive for a longer period of time. Yeah, I mean, that's questionable carbon policy, and the benefits are, you know, pretty minimal, if not, having more of an adverse effect. But the important thing to remember is not to have, you know, those negative examples be painted with a single brushstroke. And, you know, we really don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the baby, or the really good thing that we're trying to promote and has a very valuable carbon mitigation strategy and benefit, is using wood from responsible forest management, producing a wood fuel, using it locally, using it in high efficiency boilers of 80 to 85% efficiency, and directly displace the use of fossil fuels. And I'll talk more about that pathway and some of the specifics here. So we're not talking about that top one, and we are talking about the So moving on, I think it's important to just take a collective step back and really review the basics. I'm sure everyone remembers their 6th grade, science class and looking at the carbon cycle, but let's do a quick refresher. So when forests are growing, they are, through photosynthesis, sequestering carbon dioxide in the tissue and the stem of that tree and the woody biomass, both the above ground and the below ground. And then there's also carbon being built up and stored in the soil. But that is not a one-way path. As forests grow over time, they are both absorbing carbon, but they're also emitting carbon. So forests are both a sink and a source, and there's a perpetual cycling of carbon dioxide between forests and the atmosphere. in addition to this flux of carbon and perpetual cycling between the atmosphere and the forest, we also have times when the net amount of carbon dioxide is greater than the amount being respired or released by the forest. But there are also times when the amount of carbon emitted is considerably more. So major disturbance, pest and wind and storm damage can be cause of large releases of CO2. And certainly fires, not as prevalent in the Northeast United States, but in Western US and Rockies and up through Canada into Alaska, there are millions of acres of forest that burn annually. So huge releases of carbon dioxide. So when we look at this on the global scale, we have a balanced amount of carbon, more or less, fluxing between forests and the terrestrial sinks of carbon in the atmosphere, and the same thing with the ocean. By contrast, we have biomass that took hundreds of millions of years to form into fossil fuels, and the extraction of 100-million-year-old fossil fuels and burning is a one-way ticket into the atmosphere. So a pretty distinct difference. And a lot of the carbon policy internationally has fundamentally acknowledged this difference between geologic forms of carbon and biogenic forms of carbon, even though the molecule of CO2 performs exactly the same in the atmosphere. So, in terms of global warming potential of a molecule of CO2, the atmosphere doesn't distinguish between biogenic and geologic, but as global citizens and as societies and economies, we do have to fundamentally have policy that makes a clear distinction between them, because you cannot treat them all the same. So when we're looking at wood heating and buildings, we're talking about taking that natural carbon cycle of the net amount of carbon being fluxed between the forest and the atmosphere, and essentially mimicking it with the extraction and combustion of that fuel. Now, obviously, those red arrows indicate some small amount of CO2 released from the fossil fuel that goes into the harvesting and the skidding and the chipping and the transport of that fuel, but that amount of CO2 accounts for generally less than 5% of the energy content of the fuel. So pretty small amount of fossil energy input given the energy value of the fuel itself. And again, by contrast, we have facilities heating with fossil fuels, and that's a one-way ticket to the atmosphere. So another really important point is to note, and Andy did a great job of doing this, but I want to kind of reiterate the point that oftentimes people think of a unharvested forest as fundamentally sequestering more carbon than a harvested one. And so when we look at harvest job where you have this ding of carbon removed from that forest, that's like what people focus on is there was X amount and then you came in and you lowered that. But over time, you're seeing a forest respond to the open canopy and more sunlight and resources to grow healthier, stronger, more vibrant and resilient forests, and achieve more carbon storage in a managed regime where carbon sequestration is a part of that. This is part of silviculture, and oftentimes that that piece of the puzzle is not built into the modeling and the analysis, and can skew the results. So in Vermont, as one of the graphs that Andy put up in his slide deck showed, that and across the region, there's been more wood grown annually than what is harvested. And so this graph shows over the last few inventories of U.S. Forest Service FIA data, that as a result of growing more wood than what we harvest each year, that our forests are getting older. And so we have fewer stands and less volume of inventory in early successional 0 to 20 years. We're seeing declines in the 20 to 21. We're seeing fairly stable levels in the 41 to 60 year old stands of forest. But as you get into these older classifications of 80 to 100 year and 100 year plus, you can see dramatic increases over time that we're adding a lot more volume in our older stands of trees. And I'm showing this for data for Vermont, but I think we're seeing that more and more across the region, which is a sign that we're harvesting wood, but we're building carbon, and more carbon is being stored as those stands are increasing in age over time. But there's a downside to that, because if they get too old, they'll be more susceptible to mortality and more carbon release and slower growth rates. So there's kind of this happy medium where harvesting more will actually keep that in equilibrium. So the next thing I want to do is spend a little time stepping back and look at the really, really, really big picture here. And this is a graph from 3 different data sources amalgamated into one graph. Some of it being ice core samples, looking at atmospheric levels of CO2 and going back 10,000 years. So for 10,000 or 9,000 plus years, we have had really stable levels of atmospheric CO2. And then all of a sudden, something happened in the 1900s and or late 1800s, where those stable levels, there was a dramatic change, and we saw this skyrocketing from in the range of 270 ppm to nearly 400 ppm of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. So obviously that trigger was something major, and the smoking gun is our use of fossil fuel. So this graph, by and large, explains that pivotal point in the Earth's atmosphere of the increase of CO2 levels, and it's important to look at this 140-year-old time frame from the 1880s to 2020, and realize that initially for human-caused global carbon emissions, that land use change or deforestation was a major contributor, and early on that was like the primary source of human-caused CO2 emissions. But as the Industrial Revolution came along, the use of coal started increasing, and then into the 1940s and 50s, we just saw the dramatic rise in the use of oil and gas, in addition to further growth of coal use. And so, when we talk about our energy sources and reducing carbon footprints, the #1 cause of global climate change is our human use of fossil fuels. Like, full stop, period. That's a very solid definitive statement. So the #1 strategy that we need to be deploying is reducing, and better yet, eliminating the use of fossil fuels. So when we look at wood heating and creating markets for low-grade wood, not only are we protecting forests and creating an economic revenue to make sure that forests are managed as forests in perpetuity, but then we're using them locally to directly displace fossil fuels. So wood heating is fundamentally a strategy that simultaneously addresses these 2 critical issues in the long-term global mitigation of CO2 emissions. So oftentimes people talk about carbon neutrality, and is it carbon negative, is it carbon positive, or is carbon neutral? And I think all of that language really misses the point, that when you account for over 100-year life cycle analysis with following EPA and IPCC guidelines for the carbon accounting, wood fuels are a low carbon or carbon better alternative to the amount of CO2 emitted per million BTU of energy compared to oil, propane, and natural gas and coal. And the high efficiency use of that wood fuel, where when we're using it to produce thermal energy as the primary product and not electricity, we're getting 300 times more of the energy value out of it than making electricity. So, big distinction between pellets being shipped halfway around the world to co-fire in a coal plant to make electricity versus local use to displace fossil fuel. So I'll wrap things up and leave you with probably one of the more succinct quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I've used that acronym IPCC. They are the subsidiary of the United Nations that is like the authority on climate change science and policy guidance. And this came out of their 4th assessment report. In the long term, I know it's bad habit or bad form to read directly from a slide, but I'm going to do it anyhow for impact. In the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining and increasing forest carbon stocks while simultaneously producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the greatest sustained mitigation benefit. And so I think this quote does such a great job to say, essentially, you can have your cake and eat it too if you do it right. And that oftentimes people don't think of forest management and the use of wood energy as something where it's an and, it's a either or. Like we either use a forest and cause damage and burn wood, and that's a fundamentally bad thing. But you can actually do both simultaneously, and I think this is a pretty strong endorsement of that fact. So to wrap things up, if we source wood from local well-managed forests, we're creating viable markets for low-grade wood that help keep managed forests intact and allow us to practice good forest management and do things that stimulate the growth of the remaining trees. And if we use the fuels locally in high efficiency applications like heating and directly displace heating oil, propane, and natural gas with that fuel, wood heating is an incredibly effective long-term carbon emission mitigation strategy. So with that, I will share and turn it back over to Jim.
Good. Thank you, Adam and Andy. I have a couple of questions came in, and actually Andy answered them online here. So we again ask you to submit your questions, and we can do it verbally or in writing. I refer you to the panel to see that answer, and if anything, maybe we can cover that if we don't have any other questions. But right now I see one that says, address the relationship in using 100-year impacts with a near-term impact in the next 20 years. I think that also refers to the fact that very often we hear that it's darned important to take care of carbon within the next 20 years because we're all going to be severely impacted by that time. Adam, Andy, what do you think?
Adam, you want to handle that one? No. So I'm sorry, could you repeat it one more time, the question?
Okay, it says address the relationship between using 100-year impacts with a near-term analysis. Basically, it's saying let's do the analysis on 100 years versus the next 20 years of the future that we see right now.
Yeah. So I would just say, I don't feel like I'm qualified, since I'm not doing that research. I don't feel like I'm qualified to talk about some of the nuances of, the specific research and different things. I would just say one of the things that concerns me that hopefully came across in my presentation is I like to have a dialogue, an intellectually honest dialogue about this sort of stuff. And sometimes we have researchers that, you know, have different studies. They're trying to do the best thing, and they put out a 20-year study versus a 40 or 60-year, and it's taken out of context, and that gets lost in the overall conversation. So, you know, I'm not for 100 years. I think all these analyses are great. I just, you know, believe we should be having an honest dialogue about this, and we're all working towards the same thing. I don't think 20 years is better or worse than the next, but, you know, over the long term, we should be working together to resolve the issue.
Andy, one of the comments here, it says, the early part of forest regrowth has less CO2 sequestration than an ongoing forest of that same area that has not been altered. Can you just, do you agree with that? Or, you know, how do you feel about that?
You know, I think that's valid. I think, you know, again, I think you want to look through the carbon lens or through any specific lens. You know, I don't want to look through just an industry lens. I feel like diversity across the landscape is good, trying to maximize the benefits for carbon while we're trying to maximize the benefits for wildlife or people, you know, for our own utilization. I think sometimes, you know, I may run into trouble here, but like, you know, the carbon neutral sort of conversation about whether or not burning with wood's carbon neutral, you know, to me, it's okay, you know, maybe it is, maybe it's not, depending on the study, how you run the study, but it seems like it's awfully good compared to the alternative, you know, and so I just sort of step back and try not to look myopic. So I think that study would be great, you know, and that sort of stuff, but you know, I just sort of look big picture.
I'll make a quick comment that just is, Adam, if just give me a second here, is just that I think that if wood was not being harvested for the last 100 years on an ongoing cycle, you could talk like that it's low here, but the fact is that it's been spread out. You're harvesting here, but not there. And it's basically, what percentage is being harvested in any given year? It's, you know, small, 10% or whatever you might say. And all of that has been going on for so long with this sort of cyclical use of your land that it ends up being to your advantage, you know, over the long haul. It's really not an impact. You're not degrading the amount of oxygen coming out of the forest because it's always on that cycle. One thing is recovering and now it's recovered fully, while others are just being harvested this year. Adam, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the time question is a really important one, because we do have a ticking clock, and we have an imperative to address this issue to maintain global, you know, temperatures at or below, you know, 2 or 3 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years. So you know, I think it's a couple of framing thoughts on this. The first one is short-term thinking got us into this predicament, and using a myopic focus on only things that yield immediate carbon benefits in a much shorter time frame will completely eliminate effective strategies. That the scale of our fossil fuel dependence is so great that we have to have all hands on deck, every tool in the toolbox, starting like yesterday, to address this issue. So I think there have been some good examples of some proposed large projects in the Northeast where an institution said, hey, we're going to get off of number 6 heating oil. We're going to do a big project and do a district heating of our entire campus, and then ran into some backlash and some public pushback on, hey, you're going to be emitting more carbon in the short term. And yes, there's all these long-term carbon benefits. But the reality is, by choosing not to do a wood heating project, they have perpetuated the continued use of their fossil fuels for the next decade or possibly longer. So, it's an important and it's a challenging question of how can you justify doing something when we have the short time period where the real benefits kick in longer term? I think there have been a lot of IPCC reports that have shown that it's really the long-term reduction of atmospheric levels of CO2 and strategies that provide it that have the most durable benefit because there's so much carbon fluxing between oceans and forests in the atmosphere already, that there's a lot of noise there. So anything that we can do to get durable long-term reductions, like the displacement of fossil fuel, will have the best long-term benefit. So I think we have to have a portfolio of conservation, efficiency, other technologies, and wood heating as a here and now bridge strategy to get us to where we need to be.
Good. Any other questions, please enter them in. One thing I've always asked about is leaving tops in the woods, leaving the miscellaneous pieces of harvested trees in the woods versus sending them all to a power plant or something, and thinking about the level of carbon in the soil, or, the fact that you've got to fertilize something in the forest. Andy, can you just explain something about that to me?
Yeah, so it's a good thing to be thinking about. Folks should be thinking about there's different, benefits to leaving those tops in the woods versus pulling them out. The research that sort of I go back to, haven't done thorough analysis of, a lot of recent research. So, but the, one I'm most familiar with recently, in the last 10 years, is Bill Leake's research looking at biomass. Repetitive biomass harvest and sort of how that impacts soils and nutrients. And, my understanding from that is, intermittent biomass harvesting is not affecting the soil. If you had short rotations and were regularly coming back, to do biomass harvesting, it would be a much greater concern. But sort of the levels we see in typical ownerships, is not having a major impact. That's not saying you should pull all the tops out and biomass them. For a lot of loggers currently with markets, they almost, they're losing money off those tops, so it's almost a paid service at this point. There's benefits to leaving at least some of the tops in the woods for wildlife. There's different, strategies and really thoughtful things you can do to provide, better habitat with that, or, things you can do. But so that's just generally how I think about it. But again, going back to diversity, so it's okay to pull some out. Do you want to pull all of them out with every single, ownership? Definitely not. But that sort of solves itself just based on what I talked about during my presentation.
Okay. What about forest? Go ahead.
In addition to that, just the every site's different, and every silvicultural management plan is different. So when and where you prescribe poultry harvesting and pull more of that out on a highly productive site versus a more sensitive site, and that's more conducive to stem only harvesting. I think that's kind of a pretty typical delineation, that there's not a one size fits all. All silviculture and treatments are highly site specific. Is that true for you, Andy?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for mentioning that. That's a great point.
Andy, what about forest fires? We've been really lucky to not have any significant fires here, and yet you look out west and it's quite tragic. And just what kind of management in the forest prevents forest fires, or is that something we practice here to try to prevent forest fires within that management scenario?
Now we're getting into some of my favorite stuff. I'm always interested in prescribed burning in the state and sort of some of the ecology of fire in the state. So there's a bit of a transition zone sort of south of the White Mountains, where we have more, fire historically has been a greater disturbance regime. We've had, more like a higher fire return interval, shorter fire return interval south of the White Mountains. And then there's very specific locations, like our Pine Barrens, which are fire dependent communities. So in those areas, those are the places where we're going to have fires around here. Some people say, we have an asbestos forest, it's never going to burn. Our forest will burn in very droughty conditions. If we have a number of, drought years, we could have a fair amount of probably the southern part of the state, with the potential to burn. But we do not have the natural communities that we have out there, they have out west, those fire dependent natural communities that are sort of built to be volatile and built to create fire so they can regenerate. The couple of exceptions that I mentioned, are in the pine barrens. And for us, that's sort of one of these, management questions is, do you want to promote fires in those sort of dangerous areas? Those are globally rare natural communities. To me, that's exciting. We have globally rare species of moths and butterflies, but they're still, unique things around here, and they depend on fire and the structure related to fire. So I might say, that's something pretty unique. We may want to have, promote fire in some parts of the state. And in general, we're going to have pretty moderate fire behavior in any given year unless, we have really extreme droughts over a number of years.
Okay. Here's a comment back about the waste left in the wood. He says, I've heard that contributes to atmospheric methane production. Is that actually correct? How does that work?
Yeah, and in general, you have aerobic decomposition in the forest. I mean, if you have a swamp or a cow manure lagoon where you have aerobic, oxygen or airflow, you're producing methane through decomposition. But a bunch of sticks and stumps and tops and limbs left behind in the forest, it's by and large aerobic decomposition, which produces CO2, not CH4.
Okay, so CO2 being less impactful than the methane.
Yeah, I mean, methane having 22 times more global warming potential than CO2. So, I hear people talk about methane from leaving tops and limbs in the forest, but unless they're being felled in a wetland, they're in standing water. Generally, pretty minimal amount of methane production.
There's one thing that we didn't talk about real clearly is that there's a lot of forestry going on for, say, logging, just say specifically looking for lumber. And those organizations that are pulling out those logs and bringing them to their site then have waste on their own. And that waste ends up being sometimes kiln dried and sometimes it's just a raw log, but it goes someplace. So there's a lot of byproduct to the wood that we're harvesting, and people would say, well, we need to harvest that wood because that also sequesters carbon for decades because it's in a house or in furniture or so forth. But there's those sort of side pieces that are coming off, and we can't base our heating systems, being fueled by that fuel because there's not quite enough of it typically. But on the other hand, there's a lot out there that's being used for different things. So. Any other questions? I don't see any other questions coming in. And let's see if there's anything else here. No. Okay. Anything else you guys want to bring up?
I mean, I think one point that I'd like to make, piggybacking what Jim, you were saying about the waste products from the other more durable products, is if we as a culture and society and economy have more demand for wood products in how we build our buildings or our furniture and use wood to displace steel, concrete, plastic, glass, and other things that have a much higher carbon footprint in their production, that increase in the carbon storage and all the carbon benefits of using durable wood products as an alternative to other building materials, that's a great strategy. And by increasing the demand for those products, there will be more byproduct to be used for heating fuels with a lower impact, and therefore more supply at a reasonable price over a longer period of time to further displace fossil fuels in our heating sector. So there is this symbiotic relationship, and from a carbon mitigation strategy, thinking about not just our energy side of things, but also how we build buildings and using and specifying more wood in its construction is also a piece of the puzzle. So and those go hand in hand. So I'll leave that as a parting thought.
Okay. Andy, your thoughts?
No, nothing much to add, just appreciate the opportunity to be here. And, we're still resources. If anyone has questions in the future, and or needs information, certainly reach out to me. I'm happy to speak with you.
if you have friends that own forests, or if you own a forest
Yeah.
yourself, call Andy
absolutely.
and talk about that. So great.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you for attending. This will probably be recorded. So if you want to be able to pass it on to someone else, we'll have a recording up on our website, and you can always, contact me or try to figure out where that is. But our website is frolingenergy.com. You'll find something under resources where there's some prior recordings there. And I thank you very much for attending today. If you'd like a PDF of the slides today, please write and ask. Thank you very much.